For months, the Donbas region has been described as frozen ground where nothing truly changes, only lines move slightly forward or slightly back, and every announcement sounds the same. Then something happened that forced analysts to stop repeating old language. Not because one city suddenly fell, or because a single weapon appeared on the battlefield, but because the pattern itself broke. When patterns break in war, it usually means one side has learned something the other side did not expect. The operation did not begin with a loud declaration. There was no dramatic press conference or instant footage designed for social media. What came first was silence. Units that had been tracked for weeks appeared to thin out in places where Russia expected pressure. Drones that normally filled the sky vanished for short windows of time. Electronic signals that had become routine simply stopped. To outside observers, it looked like exhaustion. To Russian planners, it looked like hesitation. That assumption turned out to be the mistake. Ukraine shifted the fight away from predictable lines and toward decision points. Instead of focusing on territory alone, the focus moved to logistics coordination and timing. Supply routes that had been considered relatively safe began to fail, not all at once but in sequence. Fuel arrived late. Ammunition arrived in the wrong quantities. Repair crews were forced to choose between vehicles instead of fixing everything. None of this looked catastrophic on its own. Together it created friction. In war, friction is deadly. What made this moment different was how integrated the response became. Intelligence drones, artillery units, and mobile infantry were no longer acting as separate layers. They were acting as a single system. When a weakness appeared, the response was immediate. Not hours later, and not the next day. Within minutes, positions that had relied on routine suddenly faced precision pressure. Russian forces had trained to absorb heavy blows. They were not prepared for constant exact disruption. In Donbas, many Russian positions depend on depth rather than flexibility. The idea is simple. Hold ground, absorb losses, rotate units, and rely on mass to outlast the opponent. That model only works when supply and command remain stable. Ukraine targeted the stability itself. Communication hubs were not always destroyed. Sometimes they were simply forced offline long enough to break rhythm. Commanders had to rely on outdated information. Orders arrived late. Units hesitated because confirmation never came. At the same time, Ukrainian forces avoided overextension. There was no reckless charge forward, and no attempt to claim symbolic ground for headlines. Movement was deliberate and often temporary. Positions were taken then abandoned once the objective was achieved. This confused Russian assessments. Traditional doctrine expects ground to be held once taken. Here, ground was used as a tool rather than a goal. The psychological impact began to show before any official statements acknowledged it. Russian soldiers reported uncertainty about where the front line actually was. When a soldier does not know if support is behind him, confidence erodes. Morale does not collapse in one moment. It leaks away decision by decision. Hesitation replaces initiative. That shift is hard to reverse. What truly shocked observers was how Ukraine managed escalation without triggering predictable retaliation. Strikes were calibrated. They were strong enough to matter but limited enough to avoid giving Russia an easy justification for overwhelming response. This balance required discipline and accurate intelligence. It also signaled maturity in command structure. Decisions were being made with long horizons in mind, not emotional ones. The Donbas battlefield has always favored forces willing to grind. Ukraine changed the equation by refusing to grind on Russia's terms. Instead of matching mass with mass, they matched mass with coordination. Instead of responding to pressure, they created dilemmas. Russian commanders were forced to choose between defending supply lines and reinforcing the front. Either choice carried risk. International analysts began to adjust their language quietly. Phrases like stalemate and slow war started to disappear from briefings. In their place came words like adaptive and asymmetric. These are not buzzwords. They describe a shift in how the conflict is being fought. A shift that favors learning over size. One of the most underestimated elements was restraint. Ukraine did not claim victory. There were no dramatic speeches declaring the end of Russian capability in the region. That silence was strategic. It denied Russia a clear narrative to rally around. It also kept expectations realistic at home. War does not end because one side is embarrassed. It ends when one side can no longer impose its will. Ukraine focused on will. As days passed, the cumulative effect became visible. Russian advances slowed to near stillness. Not because of one decisive defeat, but because every attempt required more preparation and delivered less result. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces retained the initiative without appearing to seize it. That paradox frustrated traditional analysis. How can a force be advancing without advancing? The answer lies in control rather than occupation. Control in modern warfare means deciding when and where fighting happens. In Donbas, Ukraine began to decide those terms more often. When fighting erupted, it favored Ukrainian timing. When quiet returned, it usually followed Ukrainian objectives being met. This rhythm reversal is subtle but profound. Does this end Russia in Donbas? Not in the dramatic sense suggested by headlines. Armies do not vanish overnight. But it does end the old model. The assumption that time alone favors Russia no longer holds. The assumption that Ukraine must react rather than shape events is gone. Once assumptions die, strategies must change. Changing strategy in the middle of a war is expensive. It costs time, trust, and resources. While Russia adjusts, Ukraine continues to refine what it has already proven. That gap matters. Wars are often decided not by who has more, but by who adapts faster. In Donbas, adaptation has become visible. For viewers watching from afar, it is tempting to look for a single clip or a single strike to explain everything. Reality is less cinematic and more decisive. What happened was a systems-level shift. Ukraine demonstrated that it can impose complexity faster than Russia can simplify it. In modern conflict, complexity favors the side that learns. The significance goes beyond one region. Allies are watching carefully, not for spectacle, but for validation. Every successful adaptation reinforces confidence in long-term support. Every demonstration of discipline strengthens political backing. Ukraine understood this context and acted within it. There will be countermoves. Russia will not remain static. New tactics will appear and pressure will return. But the psychological boundary has been crossed. Ukraine has shown it can rewrite expectations in Donbas. Once that is proven, it cannot be unseen. History rarely announces turning points as they happen. They are recognized later when patterns make sense in hindsight. Donbas may well be remembered as the moment when the war shifted from endurance to intelligence, from raw force to refined execution. For now, the battlefield speaks quietly. Supply lines strain. Commands hesitate. Momentum pauses. These are not dramatic images, but they are decisive signals. Ukraine did not win with noise. It won with understanding. And in war, understanding is often the beginning of the end for the other side.